Good afternoon. My name is Angela Cleveland. I am a planner with North Country Council, and we'd like to welcome you to the Home Suite ADU webinar. This is about how to craft a second housing unit on your property. We are very excited about this. We've been working on this for several months now. As one of the 9 regional planning commissions around the state, we do see it as our main responsibility and mission to provide community and regional planning for economic development and for things like housing. And how do we create more? How do we think about affordable housing? How do we work with our employers to help their employees find housing? And we accomplish all of these things by providing information, regional advocacy, technical assistance, webinars like what we're doing today, and education, as well as direct services to the communities in our regions. So we serve basically the northern Grafton area, Coos County, and most of Carroll County. So if you're not familiar with us, we are on the web, and we'll put our website in the chat as we go throughout this presentation. So this webinar is funded through a grant from the Department of Housing and Urban Development by an appropriation from Congresswoman or former Congresswoman Custer's office. It was organized through a partnership, which we're very lucky about, with Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition. And so we want to thank Congresswoman Custer and Sarah Butterfield, who you'll hear from today, and her board members for supporting the development of this webinar today. And thank you all for coming. This is a great showing so far. So housing is one of the top issues in not just the region or the state, but the country. We're seeing it all over the news. We're feeling it in our communities. And the lack of supply and affordability is challenging all facets and walks of our life, impacting our businesses who are trying to retain and attract employees. In fact, I just had a great conversation with the Coos Economic Development Council this afternoon about, potentially having a housing and childcare workshop together, because both of those are some of the primary issues really impacting our businesses right now. And it's not just impacting our businesses, but also the vibrancy of our towns and our cities, who are losing our younger generation, what we like to call brain drain, in their search for areas where the housing stock is both available and affordable. So enter accessory dwelling units and what that could be as a solution for us. Community planners around the state are using ADUs as a tool in their housing toolbox. And we're helping communities solve the housing supply and affordability challenges we face through, hopefully, this ADUs. It's not the be all end all. It's not the silver bullet. We do think it is a nice tool for our toolbox, though. And as we've explored this issue over the past 5 to 10 years or so, we realized that homeowners may not know all the steps to creating an accessory dwelling unit on their property. They may not know about zoning or understand permitting or some of the other facets that really could be stumbling blocks in their journey to creating an accessory dwelling unit on their property. There are lots of organizations around the world right now, and I've been wading through them over the last 5 to 6 months as we're developing for this webinar. So it's really exciting about the resources. But when it comes down to it, how does someone who owns a piece of property, who may not be a planner and used to, using the alphabet soup as in their daily routine, understand how to navigate that? So we took the bits and pieces from that great research and work that's been done to create this webinar for you today. So a couple housekeeping things before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded via Zoom, but we're also airing this live on the North Country Council Facebook page. So if you'd like to share that, if you're an organization and we'd like to share it with folks, go to the North Country Council Facebook page and you'll see it airing live right now, and you can share that post in the bottom right corner, I believe it is. I'm on iPhone, so I don't always know on Android and some of the other phones, but I think it's in the right bottom corner. So we'd love for you to share that. Also, you could visit the Facebook page, excuse me. As an attendee, you'll also receive an email either tomorrow and or Friday. We need to work through the details on that, but we're looking to send a link immediately to you with both the link to this recording as well as to the presentation, because the presentation will have live links at the very end, which we'll go over briefly on all the resources presented today, so that you don't have to go through every single page of the slide deck select to find those. So we're trying to make this as easy as possible for you. But we will let you know what that link is, and you'll get that if you are a registered attendee. If you are not, please feel free to visit nccouncil.org. And again, Taylor will put that into the chat so that you can link to that if you are visiting this or viewing this on Facebook Live or through someone, maybe a link from someone else. All right. Just a reminder to keep your lines muted, please. Questions can be directed to the chat, and we will be answering them at the very end. There will be a question and answer forum, and all of our speakers will stay on for that question and answer. We are going to be wrapping this up at 4:30. So if you do have a question and you have to wrap up before then, or you have to leave the webinar before then, we're going to be archiving all of the questions and also posting those because there may be some questions we might not get to either through Zoom or Facebook. And we'd like to be able to, for you to see the benefit of the answers to some of those questions, whether they're your own or a colleague or maybe a future friend. So please feel free to enter those. And if you can, if you have a directed question to one of the speakers or have something specific that you think one of the speakers could answer, if you could put their name in the question box, I'm sorry, in the chat box when you ask that question, that would be incredibly helpful. So with that, we are going to do some introductions here. So today's presentation, we have quite a few facets of our agenda. So we're I'm introducing myself, obviously, right now, and then I'm going to switch over to a presentation on what the state of housing is. We wanted to set a nice baseline for you all to understand what the numbers are as far as types of housing, what people are paying for housing versus what they can afford for the housing that's out there. Then we'll go into what an ADU is and permitting, both local and state, and then talk through zoning and how to site the accessory dwelling unit on your property. And then thinking about designing and constructing that ADU, what does it look like inside and out potentially? And then we have a presentation on what it's going to cost and how could you finance this. We have some really exciting updates from someone who's been doing this work tirelessly in the state for many moons now. So excited to hear the latest and greatest on that. And then Taylor will walk us through some examples of ADUs in the state. And then we'll wrap it up with what is it like to become an ADU landlord, and what does that look like for you to be prepared, as well as to have that great relationship with your future tenant. And we'll wrap it up with Q&A. So our speakers today, we have 10 great speakers, and thanks again. We will thank them again at the end, but thanking them in the beginning here. Sarah from the Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition, who's been my partner in crime on this, along with Taylor. So thanks so much for your help on this. Dale McConkey, who will be talking about permitting from the state perspective, and along with Ryan O'Connor, who will talk about local permitting. Ivy Van, who is going to tag team with Catherine on citing your ADU. Ellen and John, excuse me. 1 second, I apologize. Everyone's sick right now, it seems, so apologies. Ellen and John will then talk about the design of the ADU. And then we'll go into Ryan, who will talk about financing and cost. Samantha, who will talk about being a landlord. And Taylor will talk about the examples of ADUs in the state. All right, let's see if I can do this without coughing. Apologies again. Excuse me. So what's the state of housing in the state right now and in the region? So as a point of context, since we are in the North Country up here, we did a lot of the research on both the state and North Country Council. So NCC is North Country Council. The state, we are just about 6% of the entire state's population, but we're a mighty region where most of the recreational tourism happens in this state, especially in the winter when we see our population. I'm not sure exactly the numbers, but they do increase quite a bit as we have temporary residents come up to work at our resorts, which are amazing. And those accessory dwelling units could be a great option for these temporary residents. In New Hampshire, if you start looking at the age groups, which when we talk about accessory dwelling units, we think of, younger, but we also think of people who are older adults. So we think the populations are, for both the New Hampshire and our region here in North Country Council, um, the North Country really fit that. Our largest age group in the state right now is 25 to 34-year-olds, people who are aiming to hopefully stay in the state, especially if they graduated here or want to move back home, and could really greatly benefit from the affordable housing as they jumpstart their careers. And the third largest, I should say, is 65 to 74-year-olds. They've and I actually just got off a call with AARP today as well. So how timely all these calls are. And they've done some really great work around the issue of ADUs as well. Thinking about, how people could move into a unit and use the main unit, move into an accessory dwelling unit and use that main unit for either their own family or a growing family in the neighborhood. So we're seeing a lot of interest in older adults wanting to either develop one or maybe two on their property so that they can have both the income as well as peace of mind to be able to stay in their own communities. So we're seeing in the region that our largest population group, our cohort, is that 65 to 74-year-olds. And North Country Council heard loud and clear with some of our housing planning that these people are very interested in staying in their communities, and they see accessory dwelling units as being one of the primary ways to doing that. And we see that when we look a little deeper into kind of our future needs, we see that older adults will continue to dominate the population in the North Country. So again, we're kind of diving a little deep just on the North Country part. But that we also see that people under 29 are still an important population for us to keep in the mindset. And while these numbers are shrinking just a little bit, we also need to remember that household sizes are also shrinking. So there's less people living across more units, and that less units available as people spread out by choice or potentially because of familial circumstances. So really big thing to keep in mind that our household sizes continue to decline with less stock to be able to accommodate those folks. And looking into median household income, which we see accessory dwelling units as being in the affordable gap, this is one of the things that we start to look at. And again, we're diving into both the state and our various counties in our region. So median household incomes vary throughout our region, but they are lower and sometimes much lower than the state. And then when you look a little deeper into what that means as far as how they could actually buy a house, so let's say they are Taylor, I like to use Taylor as an example, in that 25, 21 to 29-year-olds wanting to buy a home, move home. She would right now, according to this, and that we're gonna look at three different counties from back, I think it's to 1989, 1998, through 2004. And you see the variations in what the median income was and has been in the past years, and then what the median home price is. And you're seeing them start to cross over with a gap now in Coos County of $53,500 between what someone makes or could be eligible for a mortgage and what the median home price is. And then you get to Grafton, where it's had a varied history. It's been back and forth a couple of times where, it's cost more. Their gap has been, larger for income versus what the household would cost. What a house would cost. But now that gap is starting to grow bigger than we've seen, with the gap now at 53,500, and then 143,500. And then the largest gap in our region right now is Carroll County. And that county has also seen its fits and starts over the years with not much variation, not much gap, but the largest gap in history for them so far of over $200,000. And all of these counties are projected to increase, with a doubling in Carroll County by 2030. And we'd be happy to help you with some of this data. This is going to be in the resources as well, for you to be able to dive into. And back in about a year and a half ago, we released a regional net housing needs assessment, like all of the regional planning commissions around the state did. as part of a statewide effort. And we noted what the current need is for units, not just projected, but what we need right now to meet demands in our communities. And we looked at several different labor market areas in the region, in the North Country specifically. So the Haverhill area, Littleton area, Colebrook, Berlin, and Conway. We saw the biggest needs broken down by owner and renter in Littleton and the Conway area. But the others are, close behind Berlin and Haverhill with little or need in Colebrook, but a need nonetheless. And we do believe that accessory dwelling units, especially on the renter side, which you see in gray with the white font, would really help us address. Again, the regional housing needs assessment, as with the rest of the data, is going to be in the resources section, so you can dive through that and see where the need is and some of the solutions that the regional housing needs assessments has come up with. And with that, I am going to turn it over to talk through what an accessory dwelling unit is with Sarah.
Thank you so much, Angie. And thank you for all being here. And thank you to Angie and the North Country Council for putting this webinar together. Just to basic outline, an accessory dwelling unit, for those who are not familiar, this is a secondary home or apartment on an existing family lot. It would not be simply an extra room, but an independent living space. So it's a self-contained living unit on the same property of a primary residence. It can be a converted garage, basement, backyard cottage, or a newly constructed small home. And the key features would include a separate entrance, kitchen, bathroom, and living space, and it would typically be smaller than the primary residence. Slide, please. Thank you. There are two types of ADUs that we typically talk about. We have a detached ADU, which is a separate building on the property, or an attached ADU, which would be part of or connected to the main house. As you can see here, there are a number of different ways that that can be configured, but those are the two basic types. Where can you find ADUs? And they can be anywhere, including cities, suburbs, and rural areas. And a lot of the time, you might not even notice them because they're indistinct from the main house or located behind the main house. This happens to be the last rental unit that I had before purchasing my home. And this is a home in North Conway with an attached ADU off back. You might also have spoken about ADUs without necessarily knowing, because they go by a number of different names, including accessory apartment, alley flat, basement apartment, granny flat, in-law apartment, etc. What are some of the benefits of ADUs? They're numerous. They do, of course, help address the housing shortages that we're facing here in New Hampshire by adding additional housing to neighborhoods without changing the character of our communities, which is really important to a lot of the folks in New Hampshire. They also allow for higher density housing in areas that are already built out. There's significant support for aging populations provided through ADUs. They offer a solution for aging parents who want to stay near family members, or create an additional living space for caregivers for elderly residents that want to age in place. Also providing economic opportunities like generating rental income for homeowners and contributing to local economies, creating less expensive housing options for renters, like young people who want to stay in the area while they're growing their careers or after leaving school. They typically have lower construction and maintenance costs and no additional land costs due to their smaller nature and placement on existing single-family lots. They also have lower energy costs because of their smaller sizes. Again, who can benefit from these? Those folks, the older folks in our communities, can benefit from the rental income available through ADUs and their ability to age in place. Our young adults, have less expensive housing option and the ability to remain in their communities after school. And in a multi-generational living situation, there's the opportunity to live near family who can provide childcare while allowing for separate personal space. And it's also a benefit to our communities by adding additional housing without changing character and increasing tax revenue. With that, I will turn it over to Ryan O'Connor. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to cover some of the permitting requirements for ADUs, and we're going to go over zoning in more detail in a couple of slides, but I just wanted to touch on the importance of thinking through the zoning requirements, building code requirements, and fire code requirements all together when you're designing an ADU. They all may have slightly different requirements, and it's good to not get hit with something down the road that wasn't inspected. This can kind of be a complicated process if you haven't gone through it before. And I put some language at the bottom of this slide, and it's two paragraphs from Conway's ordinance talking about ADUs. And it really boils down to the building inspector may approve a permit for an ADU, or it could be by special exception, depending the situation. But I would really recommend leaning on your town staff to help you through this process. It's what we're here for. We might be busy, but we're certainly not scary. So please feel free to email or call if you have questions as you work through this. Zoning may allow for different types of units to be considered an ADU. It might be a manufactured home. You might be thinking of converting a non-habitable space to something that could be an apartment. But all of that also has to jive with building code, and really important to understand what the cost might be for converting those spaces. There's some modular homes out there that are marketed that could just be delivered to your property, but they might not meet building code. So I would really emphasize understanding how units are built before you consider purchasing one, and what the requirements might be before you're able to install that on your property. All right, next slide, Angie. So once zoning approvals are received, then typically you go into the building permit review and approval. But again, as you're designing your ADU, I would really recommend understanding the building code requirements and working through that process together. And if you're working with a contractor, they should be familiar with those codes and can help you with the design. Again, they might have different requirements. Like, for example, building code has a minimum bedroom size of 70 square feet, and zoning might not reference that. So it could play into the layout and the overall location and foundation size of the ADU when you're thinking about placement. And the requirements for building code and fire code still apply even if it's not addressed in your zoning ordinance, or your town might not have zoning. There's still important requirements to consider. And the building and fire code, it's all really focused on life safety and how that unit is constructed. So some of the requirements can be hard to understand, but they're all leaning back to make sure that you have a safe unit to rent out. We get asked the question quite a bit because this is considered an accessory to a primary residence. Can I do my own work? Can I construct this myself? And I would recommend asking your local officials their thoughts on that. In some cases, yes. In some cases, there's a licensed contractor required for electrical or mechanical work. So before you make that decision, I would recommend contacting your town and seeing what their requirements may be. All right, next slide, Angie. And then just some basic code considerations for egress. New Hampshire has an RSA where if the unit's attached, there has to be a passage from the ADU to the primary residence. Regardless if it's attached or detached, there has to be some exit so someone can get out safely if there's an emergency in that ADU. It's very common for an ADU to be considered above a garage, and there is a fire code separation requirements. Nothing crazy, but there are certain specifications for what materials you can use to insulate, to put up sheetrock to make sure that if there is a fire in the garage, it's not going to spread, or at least it's not going to spread quickly into that ADU. And there's also protections from carbon monoxide from getting into that apartment. A lot of homes are remodeled to accommodate the ADU. If they're built before 1978, lead is an important consideration. There's certain state statutes and requirements to make sure that that lead is abated before that becomes a rental unit. A licensed contractor can certainly help with that, and there's tests to understand what's lead and what's not at your local hardware store. But if it is built prior to 1978, that should be an important consideration as you're planning out your build. Fire separation, again, that's just how quickly a fire might go from one space to another. If it's an attached unit, it's 1 hour. If it's above a garage, there's other requirements. But understanding things like that can help really detail the cost and where you locate an ADU. So again, good to contact a contractor, someone who's familiar with codes and building these types of units. Another consideration, and some towns allow this and some towns don't, are ADUs that are accessory to a duplex. And when there's 3 or more units on a lot, by code standards, that's considered a commercial unit and falls under a different set of standards. So that could be an added cost, or there could be added fire protections. But if you're considering going down that avenue, that's just something else to really understand, to make sure that's the right decision for you. But that's all I got. On to the next.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank Ryan for the thorough presentation on local regulations regarding ADUs, as well as the other presenters here. Big thanks to Angela Cleveland, the North Country Council, and the Mount Washington Valley Housing Coalition for organizing this event. My name is Dale McConkey, and I work in the Land Resource Management Program at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Before joining the state, I was a permitted New Hampshire septic designer, installer, and a licensed New Hampshire septic evaluator. Today, we will be discussing the state requirements for permitting ADUs, or as the subsurface team often refers to them as apartments. I'll be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. If you think of questions later, my contact information is provided on the slide, so don't hesitate to reach out. I've also included the phone number for the NHDES reviewer of the day. They're an excellent resource for information about ADUs or any other septic-related inquiries you may have. Feel free to reach out to them or with me with any questions. So, what does the state require? Well, it's not exactly black and white. There are a few different scenarios we'll go over today. The first step is to contact a permitted New Hampshire septic designer, even if you're only mildly considering adding an ADU or apartment to your property. So what do you need to know as a homeowner? We jumped out a little bit there. It depends. Some questions you will have to answer. Does your property currently have an existing septic system? And if so, is that state approved with operational approval? Or perhaps you have an older septic system that isn't state approved. Additionally, are you planning to develop a new property and want to include an ADU in your plans? These are important questions to consider, as they will determine what steps you'll need to take next to comply with state regulations. So to determine if your property has a state-approved septic system, there are a few ways to find this information. One is the NHDES one-stop database. You can search by approval number, street address, owner's name, town, and other criteria. Keep in mind that the records on this website, they only go back to around 1989. However, designs and systems approved from 2016 to the present are fully digitalized and available for download. Another option is to visit your town hall, where you can politely ask the town employees to look through the property records for the subject property. You might find septic records here, especially if they are not available on the one-stop database. If you come up empty-handed with those two options, the third is to submit a request to the NHDES archives. This can be done electronically, and they may be able to locate something that wasn't available by other means. These resources provide a thorough and step-by-step approach to finding the information that you need. A great way to find permitted New Hampshire designers and installers is also by using the NHDES one-stop database. You can access it easily by searching NHDES one-stop septic on Google or simply scanning the QR code on the slide. Once you're on the site, select the designer and installer query tool. From there, you can filter your results by license type, and I recommend narrowing the results further by selecting the county or town where your project is located. This will help you find local permitted professionals, and the site conveniently includes their contact information. So we're going to go through a few different scenarios to help you understand how to get your apartment approved, and we'll take a closer look at each of these unique situations and what is required for each. So great news. You found out that your property has a state-approved septic system, including the operational approval. If your septic is state-approved, you're already in good shape. Here's what you're going to need to do. Contact a permitted New Hampshire septic designer. If possible, try to contact the designer who originally worked on your septic system. They may already have information needed, which can save time and effort. Inform your designer that you are planning to add an apartment to your property. The designer will then submit plans to NHDES showing the proposed apartment. Once reviewed, the NHDES will issue a construction approval for your new septic design. At this point, you've fulfilled the state requirements for adding an apartment to your property. Special notes are you are not required to build the septic system at this time unless the existing septic system is found to be in failure. This is a relatively straightforward process if your system is already approved, so you're well on your way to your next steps. But please note, as Ryan also mentioned, towns may require additional information that is above and beyond what the state requires. It is strongly suggested to contact your local municipality as well as research your local building and zoning ordinances to determine what else may be needed. Also important to note that satisfying the state's requirements for ADUs does not automatically mean your ADU is approved. You will also need to conform to local zoning ordinances, which can vary significantly by town. For example, many towns require ADUs to be attached to the main building and have size limitations, while others may allow detached ADUs under specific conditions. Be sure to review your town's regulations in addition to meeting state requirements. If you find that your property does not have a state-approved septic system or operational approval on file, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. The situation will require a few extra steps, but it is manageable. We'll guide you through what needs to be done to meet the state requirements and move forward with your plans. If your septic system is not state approved, there are additional steps you need to follow to meet NHDES requirements. Start by contacting a permitted New Hampshire septic designer. Inform the designer that you plan to add an apartment. The designer will submit plans to NHDES for review and a construction approval will be issued. And next, you have to contact a permitted New Hampshire septic installer to build the system. Once the system is installed, the installer will request an inspection with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services regional inspector for your area. After the inspection is complete and the system passes, you will be issued an operational approval, meaning you've met NHDES requirements. And special notes here is unlike state-approved systems, in this scenario, you are required to build the septic system before proceeding with your apartment plans. Once this step is completed, you can move forward with the local municipal requirements. If you're developing a new property and want to include an apartment, there are specific steps you'll need to follow to ensure compliance with state requirements. If you're developing a new property and want to include an apartment, here's what you'll need to do to meet the requirements. Similar to if you didn't have an approval, you're going to contact a permitted New Hampshire septic designer. Inform the designer that you plan to include an apartment on your property so they can incorporate this into the design. Designer will submit plans and NHDES will review and approve them. At this point, you will have to build the septic system, but components such as additional tanks or the apartment itself may not need to be completed at the time of inspection if a detached ADU with a separate tank from the main house is being utilized. These components may still require further approvals at a later stage. It's also good to note that an apartment is not automatically guaranteed. You should always consult with the permitted New Hampshire septic designer to discuss eligibility and other requirements. This process ensures your new property complies with state regulations, setting the stage for further steps with your local municipality. So to summarize, properties with operational approval, you will need a new state-approved septic design showing the proposed ADU apartment is required. However, as long as the system is not in failure, you are not required to install the septic system. For properties without operational approval, a new state-approved septic design is still required, but in this case, the septic system must be installed to meet the requirements. And for new properties, the process is similar to properties without operational approval. The state-approved septic design is required, and the septic system must also be installed. And again, just to hit it again, that an ADU or apartment is not guaranteed, and you will need to meet local zoning ordinances requirements in addition to state requirements. And it is always strongly recommended that you contact a permitted New Hampshire septic designer before starting any work. They can guide you through the process and help you avoid potential roadblocks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dale. And now we're going to turn it over to Catherine and Ivy to talk about zoning and how to site your ADU.
Hi, I am Catherine Hembry. I'm from the city of Lebanon, and I'm going to go first. So what is zoning? Zoning is legal parameters that organize and limits how land can be used. The zoning ordinance is a legal document. So if your town has one, it is rules. It is legal as law that you're supposed to follow. Traditionally, zoning was very divided up between residential and commercial, but more often we're seeing changes in that. So you see mixed use developments and single family zoning districts are allowing duplexes and ADUs. Some areas in New Hampshire do not have traditional zoning. They do not have zoning ordinances. So if you look at this map, the areas that are white have traditional zoning, and the ones with gray and stripes, they have some regulations that you might need to adhere to, but what I'm talking about is mostly for those communities that are solid white. How do you find your zoning district? There's three different ways. So I'm in Lebanon, and there's three different ways that we could find it here. You can go to the website and go to our GIS maps and type in your address into the search bar, and then under themes, click zoning, and it will show you. Another way to do it is to look at your property record card or your tax information, and it should show you somewhere on there. Or you can always call the planning office. We get these calls every day. It's nothing that we can't handle. Zoning and ADUs. So how do these work together? Usually in zoning ordinances, you will have two sections you need to deal with. First is where it specifically spells out what an ADU is considered in your community, and then you'll have your districts. And you'll have to see if ADUs are allowed in your district. And there's going to be a lot of going back and forth between matching up what ADU rules say and then what your district rules say. Or you can just call your planning department and have someone walk you through it. So this is taken from Lebanon zoning ordinance. It says an ADU is allowed in any lot where one family dwellings are allowed. Or for any zoning district with a two-family dwelling, a detached or attached ADU is allowed. So you would need to go to, say, residential one and look at their use table to make sure one family dwellings or two-family dwellings are allowed to know if you're allowed to have an ADU in that district. Okay, so you go through the zoning ordinance or you call your planning department. They say, yes, ADUs are allowed in your zoning district. So what do you need to consider to build one? Um, this graphic kind of shows you the main things you need to take into account, and that is what are your setbacks? So how far from the property line do you need to leave empty before you can start constructing something? Lots of times there will be a setback for non-habitable space, so like a storage shed, and habitable space, so an ADU or your house. And if it doesn't work out, so you can't fit your ADU into your area without like inside setbacks, you'd probably have to go to the zoning board and get a variance to be allowed to build in the setback area. Something else you also need to consider is where is your new tenant going to park? Um, like some zoning ordinances don't mention ADUs having their own parking places. Some require one, some will require one per bedroom. So that's something you need to look into and provide that on site. Other things you need to take into account are lot coverages. Lots of communities control what percentage of your lot can be covered with a building. And now it's Ivy's turn.
Hey there. So, as somebody said earlier, there are two kinds of ADUs. The state statute in New Hampshire says that every town will allow attached ADUs. So, attached could be within a building, in an L, over the garage, in a basement, if it's a daylight basement, in the attic. Those are attached and they have to be allowed. However, I was in the State House when we passed that statute, and I'm sorry to say that it includes a laundry list of really bad ideas that towns can adopt. And many of them have availed themselves of this. So you need to check your local code closely because you might require a special exception to have an ADU. You might have to many towns only allow attached ADUs. They don't allow detached ADUs. The state statute also allows towns to require owner occupancy, which means that either the main building or the ADU has to be occupied by the owner of the parcel of land. This might be an issue if you're thinking about building an ADU and you already go to, Arizona every winter and rent out the big house. That might be problematic under your local code. The state statute, as somebody earlier mentioned, does require a door between an attached ADU and the main house. The door does not have to be left unlocked. It just has to exist. And of course, you have to comply with all of the building things having to do with egress windows, adequate air and light. You have to have, a full kitchen, all of those things. Next slide, please. So you need to think about all of these. You need to go read your code to see what your zoning code says about accessory dwelling units. Sometimes they have limits as to can't be smaller than or larger than a number. Often that number is tied to the square footage of the parent building. So we see codes all the time that say you can have an attached ADU as long as it's not more than 30% of the conditioned space, which means heated or cooled, of the parent building, or 750 square feet or 1,000 square feet, whichever is larger. I mean, that's the better solution, is whichever is larger. They don't always say that. So you need to check on that. You also need to see whether your code allows you to repurpose a building. If your code allows detached ADUs, which many do not, you need to make sure that the building that you are planning to use either is in conformity with the current setbacks in the district, or whether the code says a non-conforming building may be used for an accessory dwelling unit, provided that the ADU does not increase the non-conformity. When I write code, that's what I say, because if the building is already there, it's better to let people use it. Same about going up in height. Is there a restriction on that? And where are your setbacks, and where can you put this building, as Catherine mentioned. If you don't meet some of these rules, you'll probably have to go to the Zoning Board of Adjustment and ask for a variance. It depends on your town and on your zoning board as to whether that variance is going to be come by easily or not easily. That's a local control issue. And also you need to, when you're looking at your code to see what's allowed, be sure that you read all the fine print having to do with the ADU. I've worked in towns where you could have an ADU, but there had to be a heated connection between the main house and the ADU. So even though you had a main house and a breezeway and a garage, and you wanted to put an ADU in the garage, you couldn't do that unless that breezeway was heated. So you have to read it really carefully to make sure that you've gotten everything. The best ordinances talk about, are more flexible, but they don't, they're not all the best ordinances. Next slide, please. What are you going to do about electrical water meters? You don't have to have separate metering to have an accessory dwelling unit by state statute. You do have to, ideally, you will be able, for your ADU occupier, to be able to get to the electrical panel for their ADU. That's a really handy thing to be able to do. We've already talked about septic capacity, well capacity. Codes sometimes say that the person seeking to create an ADU will have to demonstrate that they have adequate well and septic. Things having to do with, do you see this accessory dwelling unit as being a place where someone is going to age in place? In which case, you're going to want to talk to an architect about universal design. Grab bars in the bathroom, width on the doors, grade level entry, all of those things. And as we talked about earlier, how that ADU is accessed is covered by statute. You have to be able to have an own access for that thing. It depends on your local building code official about whether you could have someone come into a front hall and have the ADU off that front hall. It would depend probably on whether the rest of the house was also doored off from that entryway. That's the thing that you need to talk about with your local building inspector. And as I said earlier, be sure, if you are planning to go away for the winter, or you think you might move somewhere else and want to rent both of those units, you need to check to make sure that that's going to be legal. Another possibility for creating an accessory dwelling unit is talking to the local housing authority about whether they'd be willing to partner with you and assist in the financial investment in that ADU if you guarantee that it's going to be affordable for a certain amount of time. And those amounts of time depend on the arrangement that you make with your local housing authority. And I think that might be the end of my, that's what I always say, which is ADUs won't solve all our problems, but they sure help. And they, as we've said earlier, they do meet a lot of needs for smaller households, new families, old ladies who need to live in a house that's easy to get in and out of. ADUs can really be helpful about all of those things. Thanks so much. And I'm going to pass it off to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Ivy. All right, Ellen and John are up next from Vital Communities, talking about how to design and construct your ADU.
All right, thanks, Angie. My name is John Heffner. I'm a program manager at Vital Communities, along with my colleague here, Ellen. We work in the upper valley of Vermont and New Hampshire, so just south of here. But before we get started, Ellen, I have a question for you. Are you a designer, architect, or builder?
I'm none of those things.
interesting. Neither am I, but that's okay because the two of us have connected with a lot of designers, builders, and architects through our couple home creator expos that we've hosted in our region over the last 2 years. And at these two events, we brought together a lot of folks like we're sort of doing here at this webinar to discuss the different components of building an ADU or adding an ADU to your property. And at these events, we had workshops on designing ADUs, DIYing certain aspects of ADUs, and we got presentations from specialized modular builders that work on ADUs. And that's what we're going to focus our discussion of designing ADUs on, because like previous presenters have said, you could either do a detached ADU or an attached ADU. Some municipalities only allow attached ADUs, and there are different sort of design considerations that go with that. But a couple of the ADU builders that we worked with at our Home Creators Expos, I think highlighted some interesting design components that ADUs lend themselves to. And we're going to talk about three sort of different design considerations that some ADU builders are representative of going ahead. So great. So the first design characteristic that you can kind of consider that ADUs are really helpful for achieving our accessibility. And there is a builder in Vermont that specializes in universally designed accessible ADUs. The builder is called WheelPad, and they are designed to remain permanently on the wheels that are used for delivery. So you can see that here in this example in this picture. This is the SweetPad by WheelPad. And so they're really good for thinking about things like aging in place. If you are sort of an elderly person living in an inaccessible, larger home, you could have a wheel pad shipped out and added to your property that you could then age in place and and then rent out the main building. And for municipalities where where detached ADUs are not allowed, they do have an option to connect to an existing structure. So this could be then sort of utilized as an attached ADU as well. Anything else that you want to add to that, Ellen?
Yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, you've heard it mentioned before, but just keeping in mind universal design as you're thinking about ADUs, ADUs work really well for aging in place, but even if that's not your intention right away, it could become that down the road. And so building it that, accessible now is something that's really important to keep in mind.
So the next thing design characteristics want to think about is sustainability. And we had a couple of presenters at our Home Creators Expo that really thought intentionally about how to incorporate sustainable building practices into the construction of their ADU products. So the first one is New Frameworks, which is a construction collaborative based out of Vermont. They utilize straw panels made from sustainably grown agricultural byproducts as construction material. So you can see that in the picture to the right there is one of their straw bale panels. And then the picture to the left is an example of their casita, their ADU, their modular ADU build. They also, as a part of what they offer, is they provide an ecological impact assessment and carbon analysis of your existing property. So if you were thinking about doing a conversion and you wanted to understand what the carbon impact of and sort of weatherization capacity of the area of your house is, that was something that they can offer to help improve energy efficiency. Also, their modular builds focus on energy efficiency through passive heating and cooling system, and they are fully electric. And so their intention is to be a net zero build, which is also an intention of Vermont, which is a modular builder in Vermont as well. And they build net zero homes using high performance insulation and specifications, as well as solar panel installation. So similarly to accessibility, ADUs just lend themselves well to sustainable building practices, in part just because they are smaller, so it's easier to do so. But also there are builders out there that are incorporating some novel techniques to elevate sort of the sustainability features beyond simply energy efficiency, but also thinking, like in the case of new frameworks, using different building materials and building science approaches.
We'll be talking about affordability in just a moment, but we'll note too that in thinking about sustainability, the key thing here is thinking about choosing kind of eco-friendly materials and thinking about energy efficiency. And sometimes, cost-wise, that might be a little more upfront, but generally you're seeing savings long-term in terms of the energy costs down the road. So just another thing to be considering.
So affordability is obviously a huge question for a lot of folks, and we're talking obviously we'll do a little bit more this in the next sections. We're thinking about financing an ADU, but this is something that came up a lot with folks who participated in our Home Creators Expos, that thinking about how to make building an ADU affordable in a context in which construction in general is just very expensive. So one of our partners that we worked with and presented at was Backyard ADUs. They operate out of, they're based in Maine, but do building in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine. And one of the things that they're looking at as a modular builder is to also think about creative ownership models and incorporating predictability within their building process to try to enhance the possibility of a unit being affordable. As we know, it's hard for new structures to be made fully affordable without subsidies, but there are some ways that you can look at within the building process to try to make them at least to decrease the cost somewhat. So backyard ADUs are in their products are trying to control the amount of customization so that they can make their building process more predictable and ultimately lead to a more affordable product. One of the things that we've been working on with them within the Upper Valley is to try and partner with banks as well as employers to come up with creative ownership models that transfers risk away from the homeowners so that it is a more lendable product, and an employer could help with some of the upfront costs and incorporate some of an ADU into a kind of like an employee benefits package. So just thinking, this is sort of another example of how ADUs being smaller and being something that can be incorporated well into a prefabricated or modular building process can, while not being wildly affordable, can at least incorporate some elements of affordability into the process.
And just another note on affordability, generally speaking, the most affordable way is to build with an existing space. So just want to reiterate that. Especially building in the actual main structure of a house. Do you have a big house and have extra rooms that just, adding an extra wall and maybe adding a kitchen area and already has a bath? Like there's ways to do it even more affordably, but these are options where when you do need to do some new building can help keep the cost down. And produces much less waste.
There you go. So just some kind of final comments that we've noted talking with designers and architects within the two events that we hosted. So kind of obvious, but it's important to think about designing for small spaces when thinking about an ADU. So space is a premium, but that doesn't mean that you have to forego the opportunity of adding an ADU. Many of these examples are somewhere around, they might be 300 square feet, 400 square feet. So it's perfectly reasonable to try and to imagine adding an additional living space within a smaller confined area. We had a lot of participants in our events that were really interested in DIYing. That obviously is dependent upon, building codes and what your local municipality allows, as has been mentioned. But if you do possess any kind of level of carpentry or other skills that you could allow yourself to sort of, just utilize your own labor for, that can go a long way, particularly because finding a contractor, at least in our region, and I imagine elsewhere in the state, is becoming increasingly difficult, especially when you have contractors that, would maybe rather be working on a, $1 million McMansion as opposed to building a tiny ADU as an infill project. Um, in fact, some of the participants in our events, the ones that were really able to move forward on their projects, happen to be contractors themselves. And so we're just trying to learn a little bit more about some of the other requirements like zoning and building requirements, but they were able to, do the work themselves. And I think that that's, something that is really helpful. And finally, this is kind of not necessarily something that can work anywhere. In fact, because I think that there's not many municipalities that have pre-approved designs available to them, but it's something to think about within your communities to advocate for, is if there are pre-approved designs that allow you to skip certain parts of the permitting process. There are designers out there that create them that you can kind of utilize yourself and then just hand over to a contractor to do for you. So other area, and this is happening a little bit more on the West Coast, but could be something that we start to see a little bit more here in New England.
And just one other note on the finding a contractor piece. Some of the modular builders we mentioned are great to work with because they have contractors that they already work with who they can line up to do the site work in preparation, and then plop down a modular build in a matter of days. But that is definitely a barrier that I think there's lots of chatter about how to address that.
I think that does it for us.
All right. Thank you, Ellen and John. That was great. All right, we're moving on. We're cruising here. So, Ryan Pope, we are going to talk now with Ryan about his work on financing and the costs associated with accessory dwelling units. So, Ryan, you're up.
Thanks, everybody. Hi, I'm Ryan Pope. I'm from the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, but before that, like a few weeks ago, I worked in the city of Dover, working through ADU policies and specifically on the financing aspect of it. So today, that was a great tee up, John and Ellen. Thank you for that. And as we've been hearing from various planners and from DES about just the specific requirements with each of those things, there is a cost associated. So I always like to just make that known from the outset, so that there are no surprises later, and then let folks know kind of what conventional and new products are available to help kind of offset those expenses or make these things a reality. So we can just hit the next slide now. And broken down cost considerations were pre-development, construction, post-development. So we'll start with pre-development. Ryan, the other Ryan, said it best, I think. Starting with your municipality is the best way to go forward. I attached the town of Bedford, have a great kind of 2-page fact sheet that kind of outlines what their rules are, what's permissible, how that works. It really helps digest the information so that when you are thinking through, is this the right fit for me and my family, you know pretty much what's allowed there. So really what's allowable, do I want detached? Do I want attached? Is that even allowed? What are the design standards that are required in my municipality? Some municipalities will require that it look like a single family. So that could change kind of the way that it could look. As well as the parking requirements. Parking is, if you have to add paved parking spaces, that is much more expensive than I think people really anticipate. If you've ever redone your driveway, you know that. So things like that, just to be mindful of. And then understanding what's the process. So Catherine and Ivy had kind of touched on special exceptions. They touched on the variance process. By right is the gold standard, in my humble opinion, when it comes to municipalities. If you can do it and just apply for a building permit, that's going to be the easiest way forward. If you have to go through a planning or a zoning process, depending on the municipality, again, depending on the composition of the board, depending on the requirements, sometimes that can come with an additional expense by way of either an engineer or even a land use attorney to represent you in that case. So being mindful of that as well as you're working through that. And then just understanding that municipalities have fees baked into just about everything as well. If there is going to be a public hearing, there's noticing that has to go out. That's an expense. There's also just the fee for the application and the review. Beyond that, the building permit, the periodic inspections to make sure that everything is up to snuff, that occurs as well. And other things to just consider are fees like investment fees. If you're tying into the water or sewer lines, that's something to consider. Some municipalities have impact fees for new unit additions. So another thing that you want to keep in mind. And again, touching on kind of the inspection process and all of those things. So the best advice you've heard already from someone else, start with your municipality, understand what the rules are, understand the upfront costs before you really get too far down the road. So we can hit the next one now. Also in pre-development, this has been touched on far more eloquently than I will. But when it comes to design, site limitations, I already had mentioned whether or not you might need an engineer, whether you want or need an architect. Those are other considerations just to know up front that are separate from the actual construction of the unit itself. Depending on the municipality, if it's a larger municipality that has a by right process, they probably won't require a fully drawn plan set or architectural design. If it's a volunteer planning board in a more rural community who maybe wants to see more in order to approve a variance, they may ask for things that that can add additional costs. So just being mindful of those things. And then when it comes to the sites, you've already heard about setbacks, you've already heard about possible encroachments, things like that. If there are questions about that or anything, a survey may or may not be needed as well. And then Dale from DES already mentioned the water sewer. If you need a new septic system, that's also going to be an expense to be mindful of before you really dig into this project. So municipality, DES, follow the pre-procedure so that you kind of know what you're getting into there. So now we can jump to the next one and talk about the construction phase. Oh no, a surprise slide, lead, which you already heard about. So this is my PSA. I do it all the time. But effective July 1st last year, there were changes to the state statute. Any new unit created within or touching really the footprint of a pre-1978 structure will require lead safe certification. And when it comes to ADUs, I think it's particularly notable, especially for detached ones, just because, let's say, I live in a 1938 house. It's probably made almost entirely of lead at this point. But if I wanted to build an ADU and kind of move out back and lease out the front house, that house is now switching from an owner-occupied property to a rental property, and that does trigger this as well. So even though it's been inhabited, even though it's been occupied as a residential property, the switch from owner-occupied to rental is a trigger for this. So I just want to make that known. So that's my lead PSA. And now we can get into construction. I always forget about that slide. So now construction and contingency, and I list both of these because they're very important. Construction is expensive. John and Ellen touched on it already. And in and around the center, state, seacoast area, I've seen the market ranges from about $250 to $500. My sister and her fiance are looking to build a home in and around the seacoast area, and they were quoted $600 a square foot. So that just seemed too ludicrous to put on here. So we'll keep it in the $250 to $500 window. And for the sake of argument, if we consider that for a 780 square foot ADU at $350 a square foot, so we'll take that middle bit, that's $273,000, which is pretty expensive. And then on top of that, I always recommend, I'm in multifamily financing now, I've done construction and home equity lending in the past. When it comes to construction, it's always going to be more expensive than you've been told from the outset. So good practice is always just to take whatever your anticipated cost is, whatever your contractor's telling you it's going to cost, unless it's a guaranteed maximum price, and add 5 to 10% to that. to be conservative. You can add more of that if you want. It's probably safer. So when you think about kind of this budget, if you're anticipating cost to construct at 273 plus, we'll say an 8% contingency of about 22, anticipate about 295 to 300 for an ADU of this size. We can go to the next slide now. All right, so house construction. Obviously, it's expensive to get this thing online, to get it permitted, to get everything ready to go. But even after it's done, there's going to be some interesting things to keep in mind. So I think the question was already asked, and it's been mentioned already that any new unit on your property will increase your property value, and with that, your taxes. So speaking with your municipality, understanding what the potential tax implications are so that you can appropriately budget for the future is also important. The insurance that you have on your property. You'll want to be talking to your insurance agent to make sure that your policy covers the additional value and any increased risk if you have someone else living there who may not be a relative, as well as just the general maintenance and upkeep as with any real estate property. You want to make sure that you have funds set aside to replace fixtures, to replace the roof one day, the water heater if that goes, and all of those things that are comparable with anyone who owns a property or really owns a property. So we can go to the next one. But there are solutions out there to finance these. I'm going to talk about the more conventional products first, and then we'll jump into the newer ones that have since come on market. So conventionally speaking, refinances are certainly the less risky, more, I guess, rate preferred market. So when it comes to refinances, if you have existing equity in your house, you can cash out refinance. What that basically means is you take your existing mortgage and any other encumbrances, sometimes not, and you roll that whole balance into a bigger balance, and then you use that extra bit to do whatever you want with. In this case, build the ADU. Those typically have the most favorable interest rates and terms to them, just because they're less risky. They're speculated on the home's current value. If there's equity there, they'll lend to it, and it's extra fees and whatnot for the bank. Sorry, my lights just went off. The other kind of refinance is construction refinance. And the way this differs really is instead of using the home's existing value, you get to project in the future value. So if you have plans and specs for your new ADU, you get to go to the bank and say, I know my house is worth X today, but it's going to be worth X plus Y tomorrow. And can we lend against the X plus Y value instead of just the X one? And they'll say yes. In exchange for that, the rates are generally higher. There are additional fees. There's monitoring to keep in mind on those projects. But again, it does increase the amount that you can borrow. So we'll go to the next conventional loan product slide, and that one's on home equities, which are slightly different. So in both the refinance cases, what you can do is basically replace your primary mortgage or add a new mortgage if you didn't have one. With home equities, these are subordinate liens, so they come in under the primary mortgage, and you can have 2, sometimes 3 mortgages on there. With a loan, the home equity loan, that one is also going to be based on the home's current value. Those are typically fixed rate, fixed term, fixed payment, much more rational or much more predictable over time. The other option that folks hear about a lot is the home equity line of credit. Same deal as the home equity loan, except it's a revolving line of credit. So I always used to describe these as like a credit card secured by your house. In all 4 of these, well, these 2 cases and the cash out refinance option, you're referencing the home's existing value. So they don't care what you're going to do with the house from a valuation standpoint. We're only looking at today. With the home equity lines of credit, I also like noting that it has the most flexible use of funds. So you can really use them for whatever you want. People use them to pay off other debt. They use them to send their kids to college. They can be really handy if you have the equity. But those rates are variable, and those costs can obviously escalate with the market or de-escalate with the market. So there's some risk in there. And now we can talk about the new stuff that came online last March now. So what I guess what has become available, and what we tried to pitch in Dover with our local financial institutions is how do we combine the features of kind of a construction refinance and a home equity loan, um, to help people kind of get up and over a couple humps when it comes to the financing. So you remember the construction loan, what was really cool about that was you get to use the future value of the house with the improvements. Um, that can help for folks who may not have had their home a long time or have not built that equity or bought really anytime recently. And the home equity loan, a nice feature of that is that subordinate lien. So meaning you don't have to replace your existing mortgage. I'll use myself as an example again, me and my lead house. We refinanced at the bottom of the market, and our mortgage rate, I think, is 3.25 or something, which is a great mortgage rate. And I don't want to get rid of that ever. And if I did a construction refinance, all of a sudden that nice mortgage rate would get wrapped into the new construction loan, and I'd be paying 9% on all of it. So that's not really preferential. And we found that when it came to inquiries that were coming into Dover, that people kind of dropped off when it came to financing. And these were two reasons that were cited. So we took those to the banks and said, is there any way you can address that? And they said, maybe. And then they said, actually, sure. So we kind of have the best features of both available now. It's a subordinate lien position, so it preserves that primary mortgage that might have a great rate from a few years ago. It is a loan amount that's based on the future as completed value of the home. Can be used for either a renovation, major renovation, kitchen renovation, anything that's going to add value to the house, or the addition of new units, which is great. The rate is going to be higher than a traditional home equity loan, because there's more inherent risk involved in any construction financing. And because of that construction financing component, there will be additional fees for the review of the construction docs or the construction monitoring that has to happen, to make sure that work is conducted and that the bank can kind of pay that out. The other thing that a few of these institutions have adopted, and the next slide is the institutions that have adopted it, so you can all make notes, or we'll send out the slides later and then you can, I don't know, pin them up on your wall. But the potential rental income may also be used to qualify at a few of these institutions, which is another helpful pickup if your intention is to lease this property out on the open market affordably or whatever you want to do. Being able to account for that future income when it comes to qualify for these loans is also a bit of a game changer. That was kind of a nice ask. So we can go to the next slide now. Where can I get these wonderful products? Lighthouse Credit Union was the first adopter, so I always say them first. First Seacoast Bank, also based in Dover. Kennebunk Savings, Service Credit Union, their loans are only available to residents of Dover, but they're open to kind of expanding that throughout the state. And Bangor Savings Bank is the most recently added one, and this one I think has much more of an impact for this particular audience just because of their relationship with what was formerly First Coldbrook Bank. And this is an ongoing conversation with the Bankers Association, with other lenders, and really local community banks in the area. I fully anticipate that more will come online over the next year or so. So keep that in mind. If you see a bank that's not on this, if you use a bank that's not on this list, let them know that these products are available. Let them know that any of these institutions are happy to talk to them about what they've made available, and see if that's a good fit for them and their risk portfolio. What was nice about this is it was a basic premise. Each of these institutions got to make it their own and make the products available in the long run. So we'll see how these pan out. We've had a few applications so far. Again, that total cost to construct is still the primary disqualifier for this whole process. So this addresses a couple of those hurdles. We really like the creative ownership angles that John and Ellen had talked about earlier. I think that would be a great way to kind of pair with these. So we can hit the next slide now. I think I just had a couple takeaways here. The final cost of building an ADU is highly variable. It's going to depend on where you live and the location of the ADU on your property. Like was mentioned earlier, it's going to be a lot cheaper to construct it if it's within the footprint, just by nature of less walls to put up, less roof to put up, just it's less expensive. Make sure you factor in that contingency. I cannot stress enough, anytime you do construction, anticipate more, so that you don't run out of money mid-construction. if you aren't financing it specifically. And then anticipate increases to your taxes, insurance. Make sure you budget for maintenance as you do with any real estate property. And then talk to your bank about which financing option is best for you in your situation. I listed 5 kind of options, and they all work. They all could work in different scenarios. So there's no one size fits all, just like ADUs aren't a silver bullet. None of those products are the silver bullet either. So just keep that in mind. And I think that's it. The next slide might just be my, nope, there we go.
It's me. First I want to say I love the comments in the chat, in the conversation. I love that. I'm going to talk about, my name's Taylor Roy from North Country Council. I'm an assistant planner here. I'm going to talk about some ADU examples. All right, the first I found was a downstairs ADU in Hanover, New Hampshire. Both of these examples right here were taken from the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, their ADU guide for homeowners. And everything is also going to be linked at the end of this presentation with the live links. This one was really interesting because they had converted their downstairs, so their basement area, to an ADU. With an entry-level doorway that increases accessibility, with the hopes that their parents would move in to the downstairs ADU. This second one over here is a repurposed garage in Plainfield, New Hampshire. She originally started this project to provide a home for her father that was retired and a long-term resident of Plainfield. Because an addition onto her home was exponentially more expensive, she decided to convert the garage instead into a living space. And her total project cost was around $100,000, which was well below what they estimated for a modular unit. So for her, this repurposed garage was much more affordable and was the way to go. All right. This next one, these detached ADUs are not built yet. But these come from the Southwest Region Planning Commission, the Monadnock Region ADU Design Challenge. And so basically these were just challenges to design an ADU on your property. These are probably going to go in effect and will be built eventually. The first one is a new detached ADU in Temple, New Hampshire. So this is an 11-acre lot right here. There's a curb cut also. And it will allow them to build a detached ADU with a separate driveway. So it won't be connected to the main home at all, not even through a driveway. The desired area for the ADU is on the southern section of the property. That red circle is where they want to put the ADU. It's currently a field in the woods at the southern end. Their required accessibility features, they want to have a single living level with 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms to accommodate any potential 24/7 care. And the goal is basically to provide family a space to age in place. So for their parents to age on the property, and so they can still have 24/7 access to their care and them. And then lastly, this new detached ADU in Keene. This family, all of their children, I think they have one son that's 16 that's left in the house, but the rest of them are older. And they want to provide a place for one of their oldest sons to live when they start their family. The parents said they would look to move into the ADU if the son's family grows and they need more space. So eventually the parents are planning to move out of the larger house and then switch to the ADU, and then the son's family will move into the big house once he starts a family. Again, they want to be able to age in place and they don't want to encroach on their family members. The area is behind the garage, so this kind of picture here. It is a flat courtyard area with a hill sloping up behind it. There's a small yard with a dry stacked stone wall that can be excavated back to expand the footprint. They will need the rear carport will most likely need to be removed for this project. And And the woodshed will also likely be relocated too, which is that thing with the little red roof right there. Yeah, and that's basically it. Any more information or any details can be found at the links.
All right. Last but not least is Samantha Marshall talking through what it looks like to become an ADU and the considerations that you need to consider as you explore that option.
Thanks, Angela. Hi, everybody. So part of big consideration of leaping into the realm of ADUs is whether you really want to become a landlord, because that is a big consideration, not to scare or deter anybody, but there's a lot that comes along with it. Next slide, Angela. Ooh, yeah. So the first step is really wanting to do a formal application with folks and really screen them thoroughly before offering them a lease. I think sometimes, we rely on recommendations, or I have a friend who has a son who needs a place to live. And while that all might be well and good, sometimes people will get into rental situations and then realize partway through that maybe this wasn't a good fit, or there was things about that person that maybe wouldn't have made them a good tenant. And so they wish they had done their due diligence beforehand. So having a formal application, you can Google them and download, freebie ones off the internet, even if it's just as simple as, name, address, where you work, things of that sort. You can ask prospective tenants to check their credit report. You do have to get their permission. If your application has their social security number on it, you can't just pull their credit using their social security number without them formally giving you permission. So just make sure you're being careful about that. And then if you wanted to check your state or county's websites for court information or eviction notices, things of that sort, to see if they've had other rental past issues, it's not a bad idea. I do encourage folks, if you're looking at someone's credit report, to not dive too deep into it and put your own perspective on it if you're not experienced in reviewing credit reports. Don't get fixated on a credit score. You're looking for basic eviction info. Everyone has challenges in life. Everyone's had different things happen to them. And you want to make sure that you're really looking at it for what's going to matter for them being a tenant, not whether they've, shop at TJ Maxx or, have medical debt. Next slide. We definitely recommend you want to check references, check with their employer to make sure they're, duly employed. Is their employment something that's going to be long-term, or are they still like in a temporary status or probationary period? That might impact whether you want to, sign a long-term lease if you know their income could be changing. And then talk to previous landlords if possible. Sometimes a landlord might give a false recommendation just to get the person out of their apartment. But if it's a small town or a community and you know somebody and you can talk to the landlord and get, the inside scoop on them, we definitely recommend that. It's the best option as far as trying to determine whether they're going to be a good tenant and a good fit for you. Definitely recommend actually creating a lease agreement. I hear it a lot. I get folks who have, rented a room or are in a roommate situation where they don't have a formal lease agreement, and that just leads you to all kinds of problems down the road. So making sure that it's an actual lease agreement, something is in writing and it's signed, but making sure that's also a legal document. There's things you can't put in a lease agreement. You can't say, you have to be a certain race to live in this apartment, things of that sort. So making sure that it's legitimate and that it covers all your bases. And making sure it's appropriate for your rental situation. You don't want to download and Google a lease agreement that's applicable for a 100-unit, high-rise apartment building when you're only having an ADU off your back garage. Always encouraged to have all the adult tenants on that lease agreement, even if only one tenant is maybe working and the other one maybe just stays at home, making sure they're on that lease agreement as well, because they're both going to be living there. They're both be coming and going. There could be damages that are done, and you don't want to get into that agreement or disagreement about who caused those damages. Well, they're not on the lease, so they're not liable, or somebody breaks up and one person moves out and they're both not on the lease. It just leads to lots of heartache. So making sure that all adult tenants are on the lease, clearly outlining when the rent payment is going to be due and how that payment is expected. Lots of times people have different interpretations on due dates. So while the due date might be the first, they think, oh, well, I have a grace period of 10 days and everything's the 10 days and I don't really need to worry about the first. Or if the first falls on a Sunday, I don't have to pay to the second, when the landlord might be thinking, no, the rent needs to be paid before the first because the first does fall on the weekend. So clearly outlining that, when that due date is and how you expect the payment to come through, whether it's an ACH transfer, whether it's a check. Definitely don't recommend accepting cash because then it just comes down to your word against theirs. And how late fees and payments would be received and interpreted. So is there going to be a grace period? Are you going to say that after the 5th, there's going to be a late fee attached, whatever that might be, outlining that within the agreement? And then what consequences if they don't pay? So are you going to start eviction at X amount of days if their payment's not received? There are some state laws and regulations, so you want to make sure that you're not jumping the gun on anything like that. But if you have that clearly outlined in writing, everyone knows what those expectations are. Next slide. Other things you might want to consider putting into a lease agreement, especially with an ADU, because they are going to be living in such close proximity to you, is things like music. And is there going to be a midnight or 9 p.m.? I go to bed at 8, so I wouldn't want to listen to someone downstairs blaring music after 8 p.m. But having that in the actual lease agreement, whether you want to accept pets or not, keep in mind that pets are different from service animals. Service animals you can't restrict from, pets you can. Whether you want a tenant who smokes or does not smoke, I would recommend outlining what the definition of smoking is. It's not always clear to some people. So especially if you're considering an ADU, perhaps not in New Hampshire and in other states where marijuana might be legal, making sure you're clear about whether that is allowed or if it's just tobacco products, are vapes allowed, things of that sort. Putting in how many cars are allowed at the property for the tenant. Might seem obvious, oh, it's one person living there, they're going to have one car, but then you don't realize that person also has like a work vehicle. And so now you got 2 extra vehicles in your driveway. And do you want 2 vehicles? So making sure that's in there. Rules about common area spaces like the backyard. If the ADU is not in the garage, is there a garage? Will it be shared? Does everybody have to stay in their lane? Can they use the grill in the backyard? Can their dog roam around the backyard? Whatever that might be. And then home businesses, whether you're going to allow them or not. Are they going to run a daycare out of that ADU? Or maybe, do oil changes in the driveway? Do you want those types of businesses being operated or not? Making sure it's outlined. Ryan touched on this a little bit in his little presentation, so thanks, Ryan. But just making sure your homeowner's insurance policy has adequate coverage and actually has a landlord liability clause. That is separate from your traditional homeowners or hazard insurance. Typically, that's not going to cover having a renter there, so you want to make sure that is you've made your due diligence. You called your insurance company, explain what you're going to do. Yes, your premium is going to increase, most likely for that, but making sure that you've got that covered. So if anything happens, they don't say you're in violation of your policy. Next slide, Angie. Some responsibilities that landlords definitely need to consider. The unit must be habitable. That is a law. So that means a property without electricity, water, or heat for more than 24 hours is generally considered inhabitable. And they have a claim against you for not providing adequate housing. So if something happened and you went to try to evict them and they said, well, they were out of town for the weekend and I had no hot water for, 3 days, they could be, the judge could file in their favor. So you want to make sure that if you have an ADU and somebody had put the example out that maybe you're going to go away for the winter, what happens? Who's going to be doing that maintenance to that property when you're away? Should something happen? Because if something happens and there isn't electricity, water, and heat, and you were able to fix that issue as the landlord, then it's going to be your responsibility. Now, if there's a big ice storm and electricity goes out and the whole town doesn't have electricity, that's different. But if, something else happened and it was your fault for not having those repaired, it could be a liability for you. Next slide. Some things to, tenant rights. The landlord can't retaliate against a tenant, even for non-payment. You have to go through state laws for eviction. So even if your lease outlines that, payment is due and after, 90 days, you can start evicting if they haven't made payment, and 90 days comes and you start to you go into their apartment and you can't go in their apartment and take all their belongings because they haven't paid. That would be considered retaliation. You can't, shut off their power because they haven't paid. You have to go through the formal laws and eviction. So it's really important to understand that even if they're not paying you, you can't just do whatever you want because it's your property. There are rules and regulations. And more info can be found at courts.na.gov. Next slide. Highly recommend generating or Googling and finding a move in and move out checklist and go over this with your tenant when they move in and move out, noting any damages to the property that are already there, checking the appliances with them, showing them how the appliances work. Might seem obvious, but if there's a dishwasher, just explaining how the dishwasher works. If the apartment's coming with any furnishings, reviewing all those. If there's a tear on the couch, say, yeah, I know there's a tear on the couch. So when they move out, they can't say, well, that tear was already there because you acknowledged it. Take pictures if possible of the unit. I definitely recommend that before and after. And then have that tenant sign the move-in checklist and the move-out checklist. So you have that documentation of what is there. Next slide. I definitely recommend communicating anything of importance in writing. Even if you have a conversation in the driveway and they say, yeah, I'm going to mail my check and it's probably going to be like 2 days late because my pay's coming in late, and it's a verbal conversation. Follow that up with the email and be like, yeah, Joe, I never talking to you in the driveway and you said you were going to be mailing the check late. Just want to reiterate that it's going to be received by Tuesday. And then you've got that email or that writing to say, yes, what that conversation was. It just makes things much easier should something come down the road and you have to go to court or anything like that. Having everything in writing if possible, or at least an email, so you have that verification. Also important to kind of understand the basics of fair housing. In the federal law and New Hampshire law, it is illegal to discriminate in the rental, sale, or financing of housing based on someone's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, disability, age, sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. Next slide. With this understanding, there are some exceptions to it, and that does include owner-occupied buildings with 4 or fewer units, which would most of the time include ADUs. But keep in mind that owner occupancy is kind of a requirement of that. So if you're no longer living in that home, if you go away for the winter, there could be some gray area there. So you want to make sure that you're following fair housing. None of the fair housing laws are really anything crazy. It's just treating people decently like we all would like to be treated, but just understanding that there are some stipulations with that. Other exceptions are if you're renting the home without a broker. So if you're just renting the home and using word of mouth, fair housing typically doesn't apply. If you put an ad in the newspaper, fair housing is going to apply. If you post an ad on Facebook, fair housing is going to apply. So making sure that you're clear about that, even though you might not be, it could be owner occupied. If you start readily advertising for that ADU, it's going to trigger some of the fair housing rules. Next slide. Some terminology that you want to just kind of make yourself aware of. Reasonable modification means the landlord permitting a reasonable modification for the person with a disability to use the home. For example, maybe in putting a flashing doorbell or a grab bar by the toilet so they can get off the toilet more easier. It's just simple things. Typically, the tenant would actually pay for these. The landlord's just granting the permission to make those modifications. And typically, if it's something small like that, it's usually something that can be agreed upon between the landlord and the tenant. Next slide. And a reasonable accommodation is when the landlord's actually kind of making a change to the rules that they've kind of already determined. For example, they might have a no pet policy, but because of fair housing, because it's a service animal, they're going to obviously make that accommodation and allow somebody with a service dog to be able to use the unit. And then just more information about fair housing, definitely recommend contacting New Hampshire Legal Assistance at fairhousing-nh.org. And that is, I think all of mine, Angie.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sam. And thanks all the speakers. That was amazing. I continually learn something new from all of you in my conversations, and today was no exception. So Thank you for that. I know we are a little over time. I wanted to allow some of the great presenters, well, all the great presenters, the time due, especially because there's some research that went into this. So thank you for staying with us. So I wanted to open it up for some questions, and I know there are some stacking up. So Taylor, if you want to take a couple, we'll go, just a couple more minutes so that we can let our speakers go. But I want to, and again, before we start with that, I want to remind everyone we will be addressing these questions and answers. We may not be able to get all of them today, but ones that we cannot get to today, we will still address those through a document with the questions and the answers, either through our speakers or from research that we're doing. And we may not be able to answer everything today, although we have some great brains on this phone today on this line. We may have to take the research off as well, or associated with cost or other things. So bear with us with that. But Taylor, if you want to go with our first question for our speakers.
It looks like most of the questions are actually answered in the chat
Nice.
by our speakers today. I think the only one that wasn't answered was the first question asked by Marilyn. Are ADUs assessed for property taxes the same way as an apartment? And I'm not sure if this question was for Sarah or Ryan O'Connor, but whoever thinks they can answer it best, I think should answer it. But
Or Ryan Pope, since he's also been, I think he addressed that. So
or Ryan Pope
any
too.
of those folks, Sarah, Ryan, or Ryan? Share.
My take would be just to check with your town first. I can say at least in Dover, they were assessed less than a true second unit. The impact fees were also less. It was just how we treated it as a municipality, just because the use is theoretically less intense because predominantly their family use and smaller than other units.
Yeah, good point. Okay. Great.
Yeah, and then I don't think there are other.
Is there any exception for the
Oh.
current use tax penalty for detached ADUs?
That was another question. Yep.
So is that if you put an ADU on property that's in current use right now, Randall? Ivy, do you have, you might have some. Oh, you're still on mute, honey. Ivy, you're on mute.
Yep.
There you go.
No, there was something I wanted to say that hasn't come up, and I thought about it afterwards, which does actually kind of talk about current use. If you were building a detached ADU and it meant that you had to take a parcel out of current use in order to do that, then you would pay the current use penalty. The other thing I wanted to say was that when you're checking your town to see what the rules are, many rural towns require twice as much acreage for a detached ADU as they do for an attached ADU, which is, in my professional opinion, totally nuts, but it is a fact. And I've worked in towns where you had to have 4 acres to build a house, and if you wanted a detached ADU, you had to have 8. So before you get all enthusiastic, that Temple example, I don't know who talked about that Temple example. Temple is actually one of the places that requires twice as much acreage for a detached ADU. So be sure to check on that as well.
No wonder it was on such a large parcel.
Yeah, well, that's why, because you had to have, if it's in the part of town I think it's in, you had to have 8 acres to have that detached ADU.
Yeah. Luckily they had their own entrance. That was awesome. I think that was the last one.
Yeah,
Hopefully, I don't know if Marshall's still on or not, if that answered your question, honey.
But yeah, I think everyone else's questions have been answered. Yeah.
Great.
And
Well,
there are
we will.
no Facebook questions, so we're good.
Awesome. Well, just to reiterate, we are going to take those just so that you don't have to memorize them today, and in case you wanted to refer back to them, because I did see some of our participants answering some of those. So thanks to New Hampshire Housing Finance and other friends that are helping to answer those questions. So I'm going to go back to the presentation just for a sec. And I want to mention that we did archive all of the resources that were mentioned today. So these will be included in the slides, and all of these are active links that you can go and take, or phone numbers for that matter. That's not active, obviously, but reference in the future so that when you start to look into ADU for your property, you can be successful and be able to utilize those. So thanks again to our speakers, all of these folks. Again, their information will be in the slides, and they're all listed here again, just so it can refresh your memory. We are so lucky to have so many smart and passionate and creative people that have been doing this work. So thank you, and thanks to you, to all of our attendees, for being passionate about ADUs as well. And we hope to hear about your success and hope you enjoy the winter, stay warm, and hopefully we will see you all soon. Thanks again. Have a great night.